Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. Tonight's episode, the episode for December 23rd, 2021, is entitled Imperialism's War on Workers at Home and Abroad. First up, Putin outlines military threats facing Russia. Now, this article comes to us from RT, the worldwide television network in English for, well, actually, it comes in several different languages, but the one we watch is in English. And it is brought to us by the people of Russia. Amid worsening relations with the West, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has set out what he sees as the country's main defense priorities in a speech to top military chiefs in Moscow, in which he displayed frustration with NATO. As part of an expanded meeting at the Ministry of Defense on Tuesday, Putin said that the attitude of the US and its military bloc towards Russia is driven by an illiterate, incorrect analysis of the status quo. According to him, the West believes it can take an aggressive line towards Moscow because of its perceptions of having won the Cold War. He added that Russia has every right to take steps to defend itself and point to a number of new arms systems being trialed as modernize its arsenal. In the address, Putin stressed that Russia needs long-term, legally binding guarantees from Washington prohibiting NATO's potential encroachment on his country's borders. Last week, Moscow prepared 2 documents, one for the military bloc and one for US officials, asking for a wide range of assurances it said were aimed at strengthening the security of all parties involved. The proposals focus on the movement of military personnel and hardware and include a requirement that Ukraine's long-held aspirations will not be realized. The proposals come after talks between the Russian leader and his US counterpart, Joe Biden, earlier this month via video link. Putin said his country was seriously interested in getting reliable and firm legal guarantees that would rule out NATO pushing further into Eastern Europe, as well as the deployment of offensive strike weapons systems nearby. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov sounded the alarm earlier in December, expressing concern over a significant number of the bloc's weapons, including American and British hardware, being moved closer to Russia. The top diplomat warned that this could lead to an all-out provocation. However, Putin went on to say that even if the US were to offer such assurances, ruling out further NATO expansion, it would be hard to trust that American officials would stick to them, given what he described as a track record of pulling out of international treaties once they become uninterested in honoring them. As evidence, Putin pointed to the Open Skies Treaty, which Washington unilaterally withdrew from last year, accusing Russia of breaking its terms. The agreement was first mooted by the US and Soviet Union in the 1950s as a way of boosting transparency around troop movements and the deployment of nuclear weapons. He also referenced America's decision to leave the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, a Brezhnev-Nixon accord inked in 1972, designed to limit the scale of protective missile defense systems. Earlier this month, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova spoke out to condemn what she characterized as Washington's broken pledges, arguing that since the end of the Cold War, Russia has been repeatedly assured that NATO's jurisdiction and military forces will not move an inch eastwards. According to her, all these promises have been forgotten and not fulfilled. The result is the current sad state of European security. Putin has previously insisted that Western leaders gave the last Soviet premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, guarantees that the US-led military bloc would not seek to fill the space left after the collapse of the USSR. In 2017, a tranche of documents was declassified and was subsequently widely interpreted as showing that the American, British, and German officials offered verbal assurances to the Kremlin in the 1990s that the organization would not expand into Eastern European nations, before then admitting countries such as Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, admitting them into NATO. Putin also warned about the prospect of US-led military blocs hardware appearing in Ukrainian territory arguing that if Western missile systems are deployed there, their flight time to Moscow will be reduced by 7 to 10 minutes, and if hypersonic weapons are deployed, to just 5 minutes. The Russian president's remarks came amid heightened concern over American weapons systems being handed over to Kiev. At the end of November, Lavrov said claims that Ukrainian troops had deployed American-made Javelin rocket launchers were a concerning development and could lead to provocations on the ground. His remarks came just hours after the head of Ukraine's military intelligence service revealed that the Javelin had been tested and was being handed to soldiers in the war-torn Donbass region. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has officially given its support to Russia, saying China believes that in the current environment, Russian proposals are in line with the basic norms of international relations, help to increase mutual trust between countries, reduce the risk of conflicts, and uphold global and regional strategic stability. There you have it. Rainer, what are your thoughts? You're there you go.
There was some noise. Let's think of the end goal of Washington when it comes to Ukraine. Why is Washington carrying out these escalations, portraying Russia as the bad actor, continuing to carry out these provocations? It's trying to do what it did during the last century. It's trying to strong arm Russia by destroying its sphere of influence and ultimately destabilizing Russia. That's the mindset that Ukraine's regime is in. Ukraine's regime is one that takes example from the Nazis. It's effectively a Nazi government, and the goal of the Nazis was to wipe out much of Eurasia's population to make way for the Aryan race. You know what's ironic about this is the goal of the original Nazis was to carry out a genocide against the Slavs to make way for Lebensraum. But from what I understand, the neo-Nazis within Ukraine right now are themselves Slavic. So that's an odd development of history.
Yeah, well, I mean, those people that are there today, their great-grandfathers and grandfathers were the Nazis in Ukraine who welcomed the Nazis in to Ukraine and served in a stooge government, a puppet government. So it's not that surprising. Yes, they are Slavs. In fact, in my own personal opinion, there is no difference between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine was the heart of Russia, the beginning of Russia. Ukraine is where Russia started, and Ukraine has always been part of Russia, in my personal opinion. So the fact that there are some of these Slavic people who turn towards the people who hate them and embrace those people, the Nazis, it is quite absurd. But there's a real historic beginning there in World War II, and actually prior to World War II in the 1930s, when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. It was one of the member nations of the Soviet Union. And there were people, especially in Western Ukraine, where for a few hundred years, the people in Western Ukraine were under the rule of the Latvian, I'm sorry, not Latvian, Lithuanian Polish Union. And because of that, they became Catholicized. They became Catholic. So they're not Orthodox like most of the Slavic peoples were back in those days. And they have always had a more right-wing reactionary trend in the western part of Ukraine. So I guess we shouldn't be that surprised about it, but it's sad nonetheless. Really sad. I mean, it's crazy too, because something like 80% of Ukraine's trade is with Russia. Russia is Ukraine's primary trade partner. There are many factories in Ukraine that absolutely depend on factories in Russia to survive. You know, it's just utterly ridiculous that you have this. And that's why about half of the people in Ukraine are in favor of continuing to have better relations with Russia, as Ukraine had up until 2014, because they know that they're dependent on Russia in many, many ways, and that they would just be economically better off in partnership with Russia. So anyway, next on the list, Biden uses Harvard professor's case to whip up war frenzy against China. Dr. Charles Lieber, 62-year-old man, the former chair of Harvard's chemistry and chemical biology department and a Harvard University professor, was convicted by a federal jury on Tuesday of lying to the U.S. about his involvement with China's government, according to the U.S. Justice Department. That comes to us from CNN. He was found guilty of 2 counts of making false statements to federal authorities, 2 counts of making and subscribing a false income tax return, and 2 counts of failing to file reports of foreign bank and federal financial accounts with the Internal Revenue Service. Now, you and I know that sounds kind of scary. Oh my God, this guy's a criminal. In fact, what this is just, he made basic mistakes that everybody makes, and that they want you to make these mistakes because that way they can use these kind of things against you whenever they want. They want every American citizen to make these kind of mistakes. So it's not really as criminal or as frightening and so forth as CNN makes it sound. This is just another example of the extremes that Joe Biden will take in his effort to whip up a warmongering hysteria against China and any American who has even the most innocuous, innocent relations with China. Biden's over-the-top witch hunt against Americans who carry out normal academic or cultural exchanges with the Chinese has now even reached the level of imprisoning these victims, especially this guy. This is obviously part of Biden's campaign to create a war frenzy against China, the Communist Party of China, and the Chinese people. So what are your thoughts, Rainer?
Oh, it sounds like McCarthyism.
Yeah.
And, you know, McCarthyism, as far as anti-communist campaigns go, is relatively mild, but it's certainly an indication that things could get worse. The only reason why McCarthyism didn't escalate towards one of the kinds of mass murder campaigns that were being carried out around that time to suppress communism was because the US conditions weren't yet ready for a revolution. Now things are more fitting for a real serious revolutionary struggle. You've kept pointing out how something like 40% of younger people in America now prefer socialism over capitalism. And it seems like these kinds of spectacle-ridden academic level repressions are the preparation for something a lot bigger and a lot more sinister.
Yes, well said. By the way, the statistic for youth in America is that more than 50% prefer socialism to capitalism. The 40% is the figure for the entire country, for all age groups, which takes in even us old folks like me. People my age, the number's around 20%, you know, so much less. So they're adding in all of the categories like the boomers, who are much more capitalistic. I mean, the boomers, despite their reputation for being the revolutionary, you know, revolting people, were not really very revolutionary, and they did not revolt anywhere near as much. In fact, in 1972, the great majority of people 18 to 30 years old voted for Nixon. To give you an example of where they were really at. So, you know, the among the boomer generation, their reputation came from a minority of them who were actually more socialistically or revolutionarily inclined. The great majority of them were the silent majority who listened to Nixon. So anyway, yeah, this is really, to me, it's very, very disturbing, but it's part of the constant onslaught that we're getting in propaganda from the media and from the government. All that all comes down to hate China, Chinese hatred, China hatred. You know, so there you have it. Next on the list, let's see here. Next on the list, imperialism's decline, China's rise, and the war for our future. Rainer Shea.
In Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, he observes how the new imperialism, which seems to refer generally to the kind of imperialism that arose throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the new imperialism has centered around what he calls the new monopoly, where the imperialist powers, as opposed to exporting goods primarily as they did prior, now primarily export capital. And throughout the 20th century, this was expanded into what's still the largest empire in the history of the world, where this US centralized empire assimilated the vast majority of the formerly colonized world into financial debt traps. So they took this new monopoly model and ran with it to in kind of incomprehensibly gargantuan extent. But this has come with consequences. It's accelerated the decline of capital by putting the people in the exploited world in a position where they're increasingly having no choice but to revolt against capital. Revolution has become a practical necessity for the global South, and this is apparent in the increasing victories for the so-called pink tide, which has contradictions, but it is nonetheless weakening imperialism. And there's a potential for a red tide in not just Latin America, but throughout the rest of the exploited world. There's a real possibility for a new wave of revolutions in the next several decades. And this is going to be made a lot easier by the transition towards a multipolar world. The reason why the revolutionary struggle in places like Latin America has been obstacle-filled and discontinuous, even throughout the neoliberal era, where the contradictions of capitalism are becoming so great, is because of the financial grip that imperialism has continued to hold over the exploited world. If China breaks this grip through allowing these countries to stand on their own economically, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of their abilities to better themselves, then the imperialists are no longer going to be able to hold these debt traps over these countries. These countries will no longer be vulnerable to these predatory practices, and they'll start breaking free on an unprecedented level. So the imperialists are constantly trying to reverse this trend through their destabilization operations. One example is Ethiopia, which has been successfully standing on its own feet increasingly, and the imperialists are ever more trying to sabotage that by waging a hybrid warfare campaign. Ethiopia has been successfully beating this back.
Yes, well put, well put. We have a development in Chile. Chilean people reject fascist candidate in presidential election, which is apropos of what you're speaking about here, because this comes on in the wake of the year 2020, in which the Chilean people rose up against their semi-fascist president. And the result was new elections that have now resulted in a progressive candidate winning over a fascist candidate. Let's see here. Next on the list, massive war budget sails through Congress. And this comes to us from the Party of Socialism and Liberation's newspaper, which is called Liberation. Liberation says, if I can get it here, let's see here. Joe Biden is expected to eminently sign into law a staggering $770 billion military budget framework for 2022 fiscal year, after the Senate voted overwhelmingly last week in favor of this year's National Defense Authorization Act. The bill authorizes a roughly 5% increase in military spending from last year's budget and $25 billion more than the Biden administration had requested. It passed 89-10 in the Senate and 363 to 70 in the House of Representatives. The NDA allocates massive sums of money to the Pentagon to wage wars of aggression around the world and prepare for even more devastating conflicts. Nearly $7.1 billion, for example, is set aside for military initiatives targeting China as part of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative provision of the bill. The US military budget is at least 3 times the size of China's, and the US military bases encircle China's territory. In reality, the Pentagon's initiatives have nothing to do with deterrence. Ironically, this legislation passed with ease and overwhelmingly bipartisan support during the same week that Biden announced the Build Back Better bill was unlikely to make it out of Congress before 2022. A few days later, right-wing Democratic Senator Joe Manchin pulled the plug on negotiations altogether. The Senate appears unable to allocate the $1.75 trillion called for in the already diluted social spending bill on the false pretext that doing so would be fiscally irresponsible. Note that they're spending almost that much in the bill for defense, at what so-called defense, actually for war. The costs for many of the Build Back Better provisions are calculated on a 10-year basis. If that standard was applied to the NDAA, that would make the war budget more than 4 times as expensive as the social program budget. As we enter the 3rd year of the pandemic, working people are clamoring for stimulus checks, rent relief, action to save the climate, and more. The ongoing threat of COVID-19, coupled with a housing crisis, widespread financial insecurity, and the ever worsening climate crisis has left the working class in deeply precarious situations. It is clear that the working class is more concerned with survival than with new Navy ships and the latest missiles or deadliest bombs. The people are still demanding the help that the Biden administration promised would come swiftly after inauguration, but has yet to be felt.
You know, this has serious implications for the future of the country, because I feel like Biden and his team, by trying to pass this infrastructure measure, however half-heartedly you could accuse them of trying to do it, they've at least been trying to make an effort to preemptively stave off the upheavals that are going to come in this country in the face of the climate crisis if this country's infrastructure is not sufficiently repaired. A couple years ago, the Pentagon came out with the report predicting that much of the US power grid is going to start breaking down in the coming decades as it buckles under the pressure from climate-related natural disasters. And it's going to buckle because it has been so poorly managed, because it's so incredibly outdated after decades of neoliberal neglect, after decades of privatization. We in California have been feeling the first effects of this in recent years as our decrepit, awful company, Pacific Gas and Electric, has felt the need to start outright switching off people's power arbitrarily just so that it can avoid lawsuits from its inadequately managed electrical equipment. This is equipment that's been starting fires, and it wants to avoid accountability for that by preemptively shutting off people's power altogether. That's how bad things are getting, and it's going to get worse and worse in the coming decades, apparently, because the federal government is simply not capable of addressing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Really. Okay. Next on the list, Chilean people reject fascist candidate in presidential election. This also comes to us from Liberation newspaper. Actually, most of the left press was kind of slow this week with news, but Liberation came through. So Jose Antonio Cost of the far right Christian Social Front Alliance was defeated by progressive candidate Gabriel Boric in Sunday's runoff elections to become the next president of Chile. Boric will succeed right-wing billionaire president Sebastian Piñera, whose approval ratings had fallen as low as 4.6% following the massive wave of protests that rocked the country starting in late 2019. Cast is an avowed supporter of the fascist military regime of Augusto Pinochet, which ruled the country from 1973 to 1990 after being installed in a CIA-orchestrated coup d'etat. Interestingly enough, the results were very similar to those of the plebiscite in 1988 that led to the end of Pinochet's rules. Approximately 44% in favor of continuing the dictatorship in 1988 and voting for Cast yesterday, and about 56% voting against Pinochet in the referendum and for Boric in the present. One of the main stories coming out of Sunday's election was the lack of trains and buses to get people to voting sites. About 2/3 of Chileans do not own cars, so the lack of accessible transportation disproportionately impacted working class neighborhoods in Santiago, where the participation was the highest, 59% of the total voting population, and where Boric received 60% of the votes, more than 2 billion of the 4.6 billion votes for Boric nationwide. Many people suspected this was a deliberate attempt by Chile's capitalist class to suppress the vote, as has historically happened. Despite the intentional or unintentional voter suppression, neighbors organized together, and those who had vehicles helped to provide free rides to voting sites. The defeat of Cast shows that despite the right wing's attempt to undermine democracy, the poor and working people of Chile will oppose and struggle against those who wish to bring back a fascist regime. In order to put an end to the massive 2019 protests that brought millions into the streets and the resulting political radicalization, the ruling classes conceded the creation of a constitutional convention to rewrite the country's constitution. The current constitution was imposed under the Pinochet regime and locked in the neoliberal order, thus preventing substantial transformations to anti-worker policies enacted during the dictatorship. These have kept Chilean majority poor and struggling to meet their needs, while the rich have maintained their wealth and first world lifestyles, making Chile one of the most unequal countries in the world.
I saw a thread from a seemingly pretty well respected Twitter account called Red Chilean, where they said that there's been a lot of idealizations from the outside of what these events mean. They say that this new president is not exactly an anti-imperialist, even though he's an anti-Zionist. They say that he has supported U.S. imperialist operations within the region. And it's not like he's as radical as, say, AMLO in Mexico. So that's important context. It seems like Brazil might have a moment similar to this soon if Lula is elected, where it's going to be overall good news for the country, a step in the right direction. But Lula da Silva is also somebody who carried out a decade-long military occupation of Haiti on Washington's behalf. So there are limits to anti-imperialist solidarity within the so-called pink tide.
Yeah. Well, as soon as they say progressive, you know, I mean, that's just another word for liberal, you know. So, yeah, the PSL seems to be more looking at the bright side of this than I am, certainly. I think even Lula is better than this guy.
Oh,
You know, I mean, you know, Lula is a social democrat, and he's a Latin American social democrat, which is far different from a European social democrat, because European social democrats are out and out imperialist, you know, whereas Latin American social democrats tend historically to be anti-imperialist. Lula has his weaknesses, but he is definitely anti-imperialist with vis-a-vis the United States. There was a period where he tried to get along with the United States, even to the point of doing some despicable social democrat kinds of shit. But overall, Lula's you know, Lula's not a progressive. You know, Lula is a socialist, whereas this guy is a progressive. So you know, that's telling right there. Still, the good news in this case is that the fascists were soundly defeated here. And I think that there's cause for celebration all the way around in that. Next up on the list, fascism's new rise, NATO's war escalations, and human rights abuses. Rainer Shea.
a couple of years ago, the UN Repertoire on Human Rights warned that global warming is going to prompt a political reaction where there's going to be a great increase in xenophobia, in the willingness for state actors to violate human rights, for ultra nationalism, and in the last couple of years alone, we have seen the first indications of what this will look like throughout the pandemic and the geopolitical escalations that the imperialists have been creating these last couple of years. I think Ukraine represents the most visceral example of how the new Cold War has been destroying human rights. As we've talked about, this year a mass grave was uncovered where 200 people, 200 innocent bystanders within the Donbass conflict were discovered to have been buried throughout the 2014 siege on one of the cities there. And apparently it took 7 years for people to find the resources to properly uncover the bodies, give them proper burials. And since then, the war has been constant. Since then, there's been a proliferation of fascist militias throughout the country that have been persecuting Jews, Romas, the LGBT community, journalists, dissidents of all kinds, ethnic Russians, which, as you said, is ironically basically just Ukrainians, which exposes the utter hypocrisy of the ruling ideology that NATO has set up within Ukraine. It's like they're self-hating. It's like they've created this totally arbitrary distinction where some get to be the oppressors and others are designated as the undesirables who are getting persecuted, killed off. And situations like these are going to become increasingly common as the climate crisis progresses. But that's only if imperialism isn't defeated.
Yeah. This is taking place in Europe, which we think of as beyond that. Same kind of thing that happened in Yugoslavia, now happening in Ukraine. Definitely something to fight against and educate about. Education is certainly necessary right here because so few people in America hear any of this. Americans would be totally surprised to find out that their own government was supporting a Nazi, an outright fascist and Nazi regime in Kiev. They would really be surprised. And yet we've got the pictures, pictures tell 1,000 words, and the pictures that we get are of Nazi militias marching with their fucking Nazi insignia on. How much more obvious can you be? And yet that's what we find looking at Ukraine. It's incredible. Okay, next and final on the list, and this is kind of a short one, Joe Manchin's war against workers. And this also comes from the Liberation newspaper, the newspaper of the Party of Socialism and Liberation. And this is about the program that's called the Socialist program. The latest episode of the Socialist program, Brian Becker, Esther Everum, Nicole Roussel, and Walter Smolarek discuss how, after months of talking, begging, and offering concessions, the Biden administration's dead end strategy of appeasing right-wing Democrat Joe Manchin has gone up in flames. Now, Manchin wants to pull the plug on the Build Back Better social programs entirely, and only a people's movement can stop him. They also discussed the victory of Gabriel Boric over his fascist opponent in the Chilean presidential election, new revelations about the scale of civilian casualties from U.S. airstrikes, and the spread of the Omicron variant. We have a link to the show listed under this episode of Revolutionary Socialist Reviews. So just as with all of the articles that we've discussed tonight, we'll have the links under the episode of the show on YouTube. So you can find it there. So that's it.
Oh, so to reiterate, it looks like the U.S. government is sabotaging its own future by blocking these attempts to better the livelihoods of its people and to make the electrical grid more likely to survive the coming decades. All it's seemed to take is one corrupt politician, and obviously the system that enables him to take down the country's future. I wonder if Joe Manchin realizes what he's doing to the interests of the very empire he's supposed to serve. I doubt he cares. I doubt he thinks that deeply.
Well, I think that he likes it. You know, he probably comes from a fairly conservative voting district that votes that way, so he likes it. But he's not alone in this. He's a leader of this part of the Democrat Party, but the entire Democratic Party, they play games like this. The entire Democratic Party, when the Democratic Party is in power, they don't ever seriously go out to pass social services bills, you know, and not for the last 40 to 50 years anyway. Not during the neoliberal period have they ever done that. They have always, during the time that they actually had power, delivered on none of this. There have not been any reforms, any pieces of legislative reform of any type that benefit the working class in the last 40 years. This is neoliberalism. And neoliberalism's whole reason for existence is to smash such efforts. The Democrats as well as the Republicans, because we know that the Democrats are just one wing of the same bird, the other wing being the Republican Party. Both wings collaborate on neoliberalism. Both wings collaborate on the austerity, the grinding oppression against the working class that comes from this kind of effort. So the Democrats put on a whole big show of trying to pass this legislation when they knew from the get-go that, first of all, the real reason this didn't pass, first of all, the leader of the Democrat Party, Joe Biden, did not lead on getting it passed. If Joe Biden had wanted to get it passed, it would have gotten passed. When FDR was president, he had a bill, he wanted it passed, he went in there and started knocking fucking heads. He used party discipline. He used the threat of being kicked out of the party. If you don't vote for this, you're out. That's how FDR got a much more conservative Democrat Party overall to vote for social legislation. He simply, you know, like the Dixiecrats during FDR's days, he went and told them, you're kicked out of the fucking party if you don't vote for this. They don't do that today. Joe Biden could do that. He just simply does not do that. So anyway, I hope people get a chance to look at Brian Becker's show, The Socialist Program, and take a look for yourself. It sounds like a pretty interesting episode, and we don't get very many opportunities to push other people's or other parties, let's say, programs on YouTube and so forth. So this is an example of that, and I hope everyone gets something out of it. So that's it for tonight. I want to thank you, Rainer, for all the great work you do, and thank the listeners and viewers for tuning in. And please tune in again next week when we'll have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. Till then, I bid you a sweet adieu.